There are many box joint jigs on the internet, but the screw advance ones have the best combination of precision and flexibility. Unfortunately, most screw advance jigs are massive and daunting to make. For the longest time I was resigned to using sub-bar techniques, that is until I stumbled onto the Make Things channel and their box joint jig. Here is a jig the size of a 2x4 that could be clamped onto a table saw sled or onto a miter gauge, because who doesn't have a table saw sled? Who doesn't have a miter gauge? Why not reuse them? The body of this jig was brilliant, but the rest of the jig, such as the carriage, left much to be desired. So here's where I come in. Here is my jig. It is screw advanced, of course. Each turn of the crank moves the carriage 1/8 of an inch. It's designed to work with 1/8 of an inch blades or dado sets that are some multiple of 1/8 inch. But really you can use any size blade. You just have to make more cuts at a different phase angle. The carriage is super compact, but it's still quite durable. I've been able to cut very thick boards all at once, no issue there. Plus the carriage has a really cool feature. On the end of the jig is this little socket that's held in with a magnet. And you can use this to loosen the bolt on the front of the carriage. And just a few turns, then you press on here like a button. It's a quick release. The carriage is driven by this long nut that has a bolt attached to one of the faces. To make that, I just drilled a hole in the nut. Then I tapped the thread in it, screwed in the bolt. Then I put epoxy around it to make it secure. Then after cutting the bolt to length, I took a rat tail file and I filed off the threads of the nut on the side where the bolt is. So on the bottom it's smooth, on the top it's still threaded. This is what creates the quick release. Here's that piece back in the jig. If I pull on it, the threads engage and I can't move it. If I push on it, the threads disengage and I can do that. The rest of the carriage is just a piece of plywood with a hole in it for the part to fit through. On the back there are 2 pins which are just cut off nails, and these pins fit into the slot on the top of the jig. That prevents the carriage from rotating. When I tighten this here, this threaded rod here acts as one big spring. It gets pulled taut, and that causes the threads on that part we made to engage, and it also is what holds this carriage down flat against the jig. Likewise, if I loosen it, I can then push on this part here that disengages the thread because it bends the rod in the opposite direction. I don't have too much to say about making the body of this jig that the Make Things channel didn't already cover. It's really simple though, just a dado, then you fill the dado in, then you drill some holes to put the threaded rod in. That's pretty much it. I did use a pair of ball bearings to hold the threaded rod in, one on each side, and I think that's a necessity with this design because as the carriage gets tightened down, this threaded rod just gets pulled too much outward for that to work in wood, so you need ball bearings. My jig does have gears. These are on a 2-to-1 ratio, meaning every turn of the crank moves the threaded rod twice. You don't need gears. You could attach the crank directly to the threaded rod. That works, it's easier to build, but you'd be turning it more. On the bottom of the jig, I added this replaceable bar. It serves 2 purposes. It's zero clearance, so it reduces the amount of tear out on the piece, but also it supports the piece when I'm cutting it. Most of the forces are applied right here, so the carriage doesn't have to bear the weight of the cut. Because the jig is an open design, you can use it for crosscuts too, just like an ordinary table saw sled. This would work even better if this bar extended all the way across, or if this piece here was the same thickness as the bar. Because the jig is so small, it's easy to angle it. So I can put just a spacer box on the bottom of my sled. Now I'm cutting an angled box joint. I suppose I could also put it over here. This creates a different type of angled box joint. And if I need to make a deeper cut, I can shim the jig on the bottom. Building this jig went very smoothly. I didn't have many gotchas, but there were a few things. First off, this piece of plywood I used turned out to not be a uniform thickness. It was about 10 thou higher on this end than on this end. I checked that using a dial indicator and my jointer fence. So I realized this after I put stain on it, so I just sanded it down and ruined the finish. But now it is uniform thickness. I glued this block onto the 2x4 to hold the gear mount. But originally I had this too wide this way, and that would bump into the carriage's clamp. So I cut this down with a jigsaw so you could get the full travel. Also, I thought I was being clever by having the threaded rod not protrude out past the end of the jig. But that turned out to be a bad idea because I couldn't use jam nuts to hold the threaded rod in. Instead I used a split washer and just tightened it with some thread lock. So that's my box joint jig.